Hi there, welcome back for another lesson in APUS history. We're going to be tackling the second half of topic 3.10. We're going to be covering the domestic issues that were part of shaping a new republic. I'm your APUSH Lady Boss, and go ahead and click below in the description to grab some guided notes to follow along while you watch this video. So we're going to first start by looking at the learning objective from the College Board. Explain how and why political ideas, institutions, and party systems developed and changed in the new republic. So we're going to be looking specifically at the presidential administrations of George Washington and John Adams, and we're going to be examining the first political parties, the Federalists and the Democratic Republican Party. And then we also are going to spend just a little bit of time analyzing George Washington's farewell address. So as you can see, we're going to start off by looking at a few aspects of Washington's presidency and then the political parties, the farewell address, and then a few aspects of Adams' presidency, concluding with the election of 1800. So just a reminder, the Constitution has been ratified as of 1788. The first Congress is elected and begins their sessions in spring of 1789. And George Washington is going to be unanimously selected for president, and John Adams will be elected for vice president. However, there is quite a few problems left over from the Articles of Confederation that George Washington is going to need to tackle. So one of the first things he does is he begins to organize the federal government. So he is going to form his executive departments. Now, while we have many more departments today, there are 4 departments to begin: the Department of State, the Department of the Treasury, the Department of Defense, and the Department of Justice. And then he's going to select Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, Henry Knox, and Edmund Randolph to be the secretaries of those departments and thus be part of his cabinet, which will be like an advisory group for him as he makes his decisions, because there's no precedents to look at. He has to make every decision with just the information he has at the present, rather than being able to look back at how other presidents had handled this. The legislative branch is beginning as well. So voters chose their representatives. States had different rules regarding voting at this time. And then the state legislatures chose the senators. The federal court system, one of the first acts of the first Congress, is going to be the Judiciary Act of 1789, which will establish the Supreme Court. And then those appointments will be made by George Washington and confirmed by the Senate. And it empowers the Supreme Court to rule on the constitutionality of state courts. And then it also provides for a system of 13 district courts and 3 Circuit Court of Appeals. So we see all of the branches of government beginning to form to create a more established and cohesive federal government than what was seen under the Articles of Confederation. So moving on, we're going to be talking for a while here about Hamilton's financial programs. So one of the most pressing problems the nation was facing were financial difficulties. So as Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton was responsible for formulating a plan for Washington to approve and then for Congress to enact and set into law. So there's 4 major aspects to Hamilton's financial plan: high tariffs, full assumption of debts, the national bank, and an excise tax on whiskey. So let's start just by looking at high tariffs. Now, taxes on imports can be for a twofold purpose. They can be to protect new industries or young industries, to encourage people to buy domestically. It can also be to generate revenue. So for the most part, Hamilton is looking to implement high tariffs in order to generate revenue to pay back debt from the Revolutionary War. So the Tariff of 1789 is going to be the first major piece of legislation passed by the U.S. Congress, and it is going to incorporate a 5 to 15% tax on goods shipped to the United States, primarily from Britain and France. The next part of his financial program is called the full assumption of debts. So looking back at our Revolutionary War, the U.S. has incurred $54 million in federal debt and there were 25 million in state debts. So this is causing a major problem for the United States as far as credit and investment. It's very difficult for businesses to grow. The government can't finance an army, all these difficulties. And so Hamilton's solution is that the federal government needs to take on the state debts and then pay it all off. This is going to build respect for the nation. It's going to convince investors that the United States is reliable and thus they can invest their money in the United States. However, there is some pretty significant opposition. For example, states like Virginia and North Carolina had already paid off their debts, so now they feel that they might have to pay taxes to help pay off the debts of other states. Also, veterans who had been given promissory notes for their payment had sold them at significantly lower prices. And now the people that had purchased them, the speculators who had purchased those promissory notes, were going to get 100% of the payments that the veterans were supposed to receive. So eventually there will be a compromise to include this in the financial plan. And when they decide to move the proposed nation's capital to a designated place that will become known as Washington, D.C., that convinces all the players involved to go ahead and approve this part of the plan. So next up is the National Bank. The National Bank probably was the most controversial aspect of Hamilton's financial program. So he called for a Bank of the United States to do a variety of things, but it's really to manage the economy, to make sure that our currency is stable, to provide loans, all of these things. But there were some pretty significant fears. As most of the banking was in Northeast urban areas, many in the southern, western, rural areas feared that this was going to provide significantly more power to the urban Northeast regions of the nation. There was also fear about increasing corruption in government by connecting these economic and political ideas. And then there was the largest question about the constitutionality of the bank. So the Constitution did not explicitly authorize a bank. And so you can either look at this from a loose and broad interpretation or a strict and narrow interpretation. So if you interpret the Constitution strictly, what you believe is that the Constitution must explicitly state you can do something in order to do it. So because the Constitution did not explicitly state that this was a power the federal government had, then we must look at the 10th Amendment, which gives that power then to the states. However, a loose or a broad interpretation of the Constitution would follow the necessary and proper clause, which says the federal government has the power to do anything necessary and proper for fulfilling the needs of the nation. And so even though the Constitution didn't explicitly authorize a bank, you could argue that the bank is necessary and proper for running the country. And so this is one of the things that really fueled the debates that led to the political parties forming. Okay, and then our last part of the program that we're going to address is the excise tax on whiskey. So the tariffs that were part of the earlier form of the plan would not be enough to pay off the national debt, and thus we needed another tax to bring in revenue. Madison is going to support this tax, kind of making it a morality issue, saying that this tax would increase sobriety and thereby prevent disease and untimely deaths. However, farmers in Pennsylvania are going to view this as a direct attack on them because of their dependence on corn as their staple crop. Corn was often turned into whiskey and then was able to make a considerable profit for these Pennsylvania farmers. They were so frustrated that it actually led to something called the Whiskey Rebellion. This happens in 1794, where farmers not only refuse to pay the tax, but they also attack the revenue collectors. Here you can see in this image, a tax collector has been tarred and feathered, and a home is being burned down. So Washington is going to federalize the state militia in a huge way. And this massive show of force does collapse the rebellion. So, what is the American response to this huge show of force? Well, some support the strength of the government, and you can make a direct comparison to Shays' rebellion under the Articles and how that was significantly mismanaged and ended up leading for calls for the Constitution and, or for a revision to the Articles, I should say. Whereas this show of force demonstrates the strength of the government under the Constitution. So there was some support for Washington. However, there was also criticism because this is a unprecedented use of the military against its own citizens. So those are some of the key aspects of the domestic issues that Washington faced during his presidency. Now let's look at the formation of political parties. As already referenced in this lesson and the prior lesson, there's a variety of reasons why we have political parties forming. And so on the one side, we see Federalists. These are going to be people who believe in a loose interpretation of the Constitution, which often leads to a stronger federal government. Most people who were Federalists lived in the Northeast in urban areas. Many were wealthy, educated, business owners, merchants, bankers, etc. They support Hamilton's financial program. And they also are supporting the British during the war between Britain and France as a result of the French Revolution. Democratic Republicans, on the other hand, you should associate with more of your rural and southern and western regions. We're going to see many plantation owners here. Many of the people that were Democratic Republicans were fearful that a stronger national government could end slavery. And so they strongly believed in states' rights, which would be supported by a strict construction or a narrow interpretation of the Constitution. They opposed Hamilton's financial program and favor policies that are going to improve the agrarian or agricultural nature of the United States. They are also going to support the French during the French Revolution. So here is an interesting graphic that you can pause to look at more closely, but it really is showing the Federalists versus the Republicans. Sometimes the Democratic Republicans are just called the Republicans at this time, but these are not connected to our modern political parties. So we have Washington's farewell address, which was not, although farewell addresses are given as a speech now at the end of a president's term. This was actually just printed. So he explained his decisions for retirement, but then the keys that you need to be aware of are his warnings to Americans. So he includes warnings about foreign policy. He encourages the United States to stay out of European affairs whenever possible and avoid permanent alliances. We saw this with the Neutrality Proclamation during the French Revolution. This is the foreign policy that we call isolationism that lasted for about a century after Washington leaves office. He also goes on to warn against domestic issues, specifically the formation of political parties, which was already well underway, and sectionalism, specifically regional issues. So he wants to emphasize the importance of unity within the nation. And then he concludes on some brief comments about his legacy. Now, there is no requirement that he step down after 2 terms, but this sets a precedent for other presidents that will be followed until Franklin Roosevelt in the mid-1900s. So here are a couple excerpts from his farewell address. There is an opinion that parties in free countries are useful checks upon the administration of the government and serve to keep alive the spirit of liberty. This within certain limits is probably true. In governments purely elective, it is a spirit not to be encouraged, a fire not to be quenched. It demands a uniform vigilance to prevent its bursting into flame, lest instead of warming, it should consume. The great rule of conduct for us in regard to foreign nations is in extending our commercial relations to have with them as little political connection as possible. So far as we have already formed engagements, let them be fulfilled with perfect good faith. Here, let us stop. It is our true policy to steer clear of permanent alliances with any portion of the foreign world. So far, I mean, as we are now at liberty to do it. Okay, moving on to Adams' presidency and the election of 1796. So this is a really interesting election because up until this point, it was determined in the Constitution that the candidate with the most number of votes would be president, and the candidate with the second highest number of votes would be vice president. So electors were casting two ballots, one for president and one for vice president, but it wasn't designated that way. And so the Federalist candidate, John Adams, is going to win the most electoral votes at 71. And the Democratic Republican candidate, Thomas Jefferson, wins the second highest number of votes. And so what we see happening is a divided executive branch, a Federalist president and a Democratic Republican vice president. Now, these divisions between the political parties are so deep and passionate. We see a actual conflict brewing between two congressmen, Griswold and Lyon, and there was an actual, basically a wrestling match in Congress in January before Adams takes office here. So one of the biggest domestic issues facing Adams during his presidency is going to be the Alien and Sedition Acts. So the Federalists were going to gain a majority in both houses of Congress after the election of 1796. And because of the quasi-war going on with France, there was pretty high anti-French sentiments by Federalists. And so they worked to pass three new acts: the Naturalization Act, which is going to make it take a longer amount of time for immigrants to qualify for U.S. citizenship. And the reason why the Federalists passed this is because at this time, most immigrants were voting for Democratic Republicans. Then they passed the Alien Act, which allows for the president to more easily deport and detain immigrants. And then the Sedition Act, the most controversial. It made it illegal for newspaper editors to criticize the president or Congress and imposed penalties on those who did. So in response to this new legislation, we see Kentucky and Virginia passing their own resolutions to nullify or declare void the Alien and Sedition Acts. They argue that these acts are against the First Amendment, which the Sedition Act absolutely is. However, the Supreme Court hadn't yet established the power of judicial review, the ability to declare a law unconstitutional. And so there's a huge amount of conflict over federal authority and states' rights. And it likely could have brewed into a bigger conflict, except that in the election of 1800, Jefferson is going to win the election, and the Kentucky and Virginia resolution, or the Alien and Sedition Acts, will expire. They won't be continued on by the next Congress. So as I have referenced, the election of 1800 is going to result in the election of Thomas Jefferson. And once again, we have a very unique election in which there is a tie. So both Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr are going to be tied with 73 electoral votes. And so when this happens, there is a special election that occurs in the House of Representatives, and it took days for them to finally choose Jefferson. And when Jefferson takes office in 1801, they call this the Peaceful Revolution, or the Revolution of 1800, because it is the passing of power from one party to another. And this was done without violence, demonstrating that the U.S. constitutional system could endure. So there you have it. Quite a bit of information on various domestic issues that happened during the presidencies of Washington and Adams. Hopefully you are now able to explain why political ideas, institutions, and party systems developed during the New Republic. Again, I hope this was helpful for you. And if so, please like and subscribe.